Amen. We're looking at the teachings of Jesus Christ, page 51 of our study guide, and we're looking at Matthew chapter 24, and probably we're going to get through the entire chapter of Matthew chapter 24, but I want to look at section number 5 on page 51 as it relates to what the teaching is about in Matthew chapter 24. Jesus' sermon on the destruction of Jerusalem and his second coming. Jesus prophesied about the destruction of Jerusalem, Matthew 24, 1 and 2. This provoked two questions from his disciples. When will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and at the end of the age? And of the end of the age. The first question is answered in the verses 4 through 35, wherein Jesus gave the signs related to the destruction of Jerusalem. Concerning such, he added, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things be fulfilled. Matthew 24 and verse 34. Now note the transitional word but of verse 36. It is pivotal, showing a change of subjects. The second question is answered in verses 36 through 51, wherein Jesus explains that relative to his coming, there will be no signs. Matthew 24, 36 through 49. Then in chapter 25, Jesus gave three parables concerning his coming. The parable of the virgins, stressing preparedness for his comings. The parable of the talents, stressing faithfulness and responsibilities in view of his coming. And the parable of the separation of the sheep and the goats, picturing the judgment at his coming. Now, let's look at Matthew chapter 24 as we consider this very misunderstood chapter. And the reason why I say it's misunderstood, because so many people try to apply what's going on here in this chapter to everyday events in the world. They look at earthquakes, they look at tsunamis, they look at terrible weather, they'll look at global warming, the bad economy, and they'll try to find it in Matthew chapter 24. They'll look at wars, they'll look at pestilence, they'll look at all kinds of things, famine, and they'll be on TV and they'll say, look at this terrible thing that's going on in this certain part of the country, and they say, Jesus said that would happen in Matthew chapter 24. And they relate it to today. That's a mishandling of God's Word. Because the chapter here, although it's difficult to understand in certain aspects, if you don't understand how prophetic language is used, it is not impossible to understand, and there is a clear transition from what Jesus was talking about concerning the events of the first century in the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. and the end of the world. And verse 34 is that transitional verse. That's why I have it up here on the board. In verses 1 through 31, it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And look at the very first few verses so we can get a background as to why Jesus is answering this way. Matthew 24, then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to him and showed him the buildings of the temple. Remember what he did in Matthew chapter 23. We studied that last week. He gave a very scathing, sharp rebuke to the Jewish leaders concerning their sin, their hypocrisy, their wickedness, and now he is leaving the temple never to enter it again. And he's coming out, and as they leave Jerusalem, they're looking at all the buildings and the stones, and from what historians tell us, it was a magnificent structure, a magnificent complex to behold. Verse 2, Jesus said to them, do you not see all of these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. That, to the Jewish apostles, was a shocking statement, because they believed that when the Messiah came, the temple would be a permanent fixture in Jerusalem, because the Messiah would reign literally in Jerusalem. And as a result of that, Jerusalem would be the headquarters of the world, basically. And so to say that the buildings of the temple were going to be destroyed and the stones were going to be thrown down, that was a shocker. So that's why they asked the question in verse 3. Now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" In their minds, the end of the age would coincide with the destruction of Jerusalem. That's why they're asking that way. That's got to be the end of the world. The destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of this city, that's got to be the end of the world. But as we're going to see, as Jesus answers, he's going to answer their questions. He's going to answer the first part and then relate it to his coming at the end of time. Jesus is talking about two comings here. One of them is providential coming. He would come providentially as he uses the Roman Empire as an instrument to bring destruction upon the city of Jerusalem. Then he would come at the end of time, literally. So we have to understand that. The first verses, all the way up to chapter 24 and verse 33, have to be understood as taking place within the first century. That's why he says in verse 34, "Most assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." So when we read these verses from verse 4 to 33, even though it may sound like the end of time, it's within the context of happening within that generation. So we have to understand that what's going on here in some of these verses is dealing with Christ using prophetic language that's found in the prophets, and we'll look at some of that, in which God says, "I'm going to come to a city, I'm going to come in the clouds, and I'm going to bring judgment upon that nation." Whether it's talking about his own people, whether he's talking about a pagan nation. We'll see that language in the Old Testament. And he says in verse 4, "Jesus answered and said to them, Take heed that no one deceive you." And it's very interesting he starts out that way because there would be much deception concerning this subject. And there is much deception today concerning this very subject. "Let no one deceive you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many." In the book of Acts, we read about false messiahs. People thought that certain ones of the church were those who claimed to be a Messiah, the Messiah figures that would manifest themselves and claim to be Messiahs. And he says in verse 6, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." Between the time Jesus is speaking this, which is around 33 AD to 70 AD, within that 37-year period of time, roughly 40 years, there were all kind of wars and rumors of wars. In fact, the war leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem was the Jewish rebellion against the Roman Empire. That's what caused Rome to come down and crack down on Jerusalem. They were rebelling against their overlords. So there were various wars between what Jesus is saying here in the year 33 AD to 70 AD. Wars and rumors of wars. You're going to hear about this. Don't let that trouble you. The end is not yet. Verse 7, "For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in various places. These are the beginning of sorrows." People look at that and say, "Oh, that's today. That's 2011. Again, it's within that generation, according to verse 34. He's talking about what's happening in that generation. And you can read history, and you can even read in the book of Acts. There was a famine that came upon Judea. They gathered up money for the poor saints of Judea to relieve the brethren of the famine that took place in that region. So there were famines, there were earthquakes. Roman historians and others record for us that there were earthquakes within certain places. I believe it was Pompeii that had an earthquake in 62 AD. They had the major eruption of their volcano in 79 AD. Pompeii was destroyed by that. And covered up. And that's what the ruins people find nowadays over there, and show the destruction of that place by that volcano. But in 62 AD, there was an earthquake there. There were earthquakes recorded in various cities. We don't have time to go into a lot of detail. I'm going to take this chapter and I'm going to preach a lesson on it and give more detail than I'm going to be able to do tonight. But there were various records of earthquakes that took place in the first century. He's talking about things that were happening in their generation. Verse 9. Then they will deliver you up. Notice, that's first century. He's talking to the people he is addressing of the first century. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. He's talking to them. That's what's going to happen to you. And then many will be offended and will betray one another and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise and deceive many. What did John say in 1 John chapter 4 and verse 1? Of course, that was after the destruction of Jerusalem. But he said in 1 John 4 and verse 1, Beloved, believe not every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they be of God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. There were false prophets in the first century. People claiming to be spokesmen for God, and they weren't. And they're going to deceive many. Verse 12. Because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. Lawlessness will be on the increase. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. In verse 14, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. Did that happen in the first century? Was the gospel proclaimed in all nations? You read the book of Colossians, and it says very clearly, every creature under heaven heard the gospel. They didn't have all the technology we have, the means of transportation we have, yet they spread the gospel all over the world. But keep in mind, they would not have had 6 billion people in the world as well. It is estimated they would have had probably 500 to 600 million in the world. So there were much less as far as people in the world than there are today. So in the first century, the gospel was spread throughout the entire world. And so this is talking again, and within the context of verse 34, a first century activity. Any questions or comments? I know I'm going rather quickly, but I'm trying to get through this chapter. Verse 15, therefore, when you see, he's talking to them, again, it's got to be within a first century context. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads this, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. He's telling them to get out of Jerusalem. The abomination of desolation is spoken of in Daniel 11:31 and Daniel 12 and verse 11. The book of Daniel actually talks about and pinpoints not only exactly when the Messiah would come, but also Daniel prophesied about when the destruction of Jerusalem would happen in 70 AD. We'll get into more detail about that when we get into the book of Daniel. But the abomination of desolation that he's speaking of, standing in the holy place, what did they do? They went into the temple, the Romans did, in 70 AD, and they desolated the place. That's the abomination of desolation. When you see that happening, he says, those who are in Judea, flee to the mountains. You're in Judea where Jerusalem is, head for the hills. Get out of Jerusalem, go to the mountains. And according to history, not one Christian perished in 70 AD when it was besieged. Not one. Why? They knew the teaching of Christ. They got out of Jerusalem. They got out of there when they saw the signs of what was happening. They left Jerusalem and didn't perish when there were multitudes, over 1 million people who were killed and crucified during that terrible besiegement of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Verse 17, let him who is on the housetop not go back down to take anything out of his house. That means you see these things happening, you get out. You don't have time. You be ready to get out. Verse 18, let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. Get out as quickly as possible. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. Why would he say that in verse 19? You need to move quickly. It's going to be hard times. It's going to be hard on you if you're pregnant. It's going to be hard on you if you have infants. Traveling nowadays with all the technology we have, with car seats and air conditioning and everything, is difficult enough. Can you imagine having to leave at a moment's notice on foot or animal to get out of Jerusalem? And in verse 20, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. Now, why would he say that? On the Sabbath day, the gates of the city would be closed. It'd be hard to get out of Jerusalem when the gates are closed. And winter's this harsh time to travel. Again, wintertime, it gets cold over there a lot, about like how it gets cold here. They have very cold winters over there from time to time. So it's hard to travel during these times of the year. Verse 21, for there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, nor ever shall be. Talking about what's going on when Jerusalem is finally besieged. And remember, we talked about being besieged. You starve a city into submission. You cut off the water supply. You cut off the food supply. You starve it into submission. Not only that, they killed so many people. Over 1 million people were killed. And one historian said that blood was flowing so much in the streets that it put out some of the fires in some of the houses. That's how much human blood was flowing in the streets of Jerusalem. And this is because they rejected Christ. They rejected and they killed the Son of God. And so here he's saying this is that great tribulation that's coming. Verse 22. He said, unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. So you're going to have an opportunity to be saved, to get out of that situation. The elect means the chosen ones, those who are God's people. It's going to be shortened in the sense of it's not going to be prolonged and wipe out everybody. Verse 23, then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christ and false prophets will rise and show signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. They're going to be imposters, false Christ and false prophets. Now that was true in the first century. That's what he's talking about now. But did we not have that in recent history ourselves? There's the name David Koresh. Remember him and the Branch Davidians down in Waco, claiming to be the Messiah. Other false Christs will rise. Of course, that's happened throughout human history. And they'll show great signs and wonders to deceive people. These people will think they're miracle workers, but they're not. And he says, see, I have told you beforehand. Verse 26, therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go. Or look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. He's not going to be on earth anymore. That's the point. Jesus is saying, if they're telling you I'm over here or over there, they're lying to you. He's not going to be someone else, and he's not going to be on earth anymore. And he says, for as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Verse 27, I believe, is talking about when he comes at the end of time. And he's making it very clear. When I come, there's not going to be any doubt about it. Every eye will see me. When I come at the end of time, it's going to be like the lightning flashing from the east to the west. It's going to be in glory and power. So I'm not going to be on earth as some person. So when they're telling you, look over here, here's the Christ. Look over there, there's the Christ. I actually studied with a man a few years ago. I thought we were going to convert the person. We were getting close. I thought we were going to baptize him. Then he lays this on us. He said that he believes that the Messiah, the Son of God, is in Florida, and that he is in jail in Florida, being persecuted. Didn't take long for us to leave that Bible study. You cannot reason with someone like that. So he thought the Son of God was over in Florida, in jail. Well, this is the kind of deception that went on in the first century. It goes on today. Anyone claiming the Messiah is on earth, walking around, is lying. He says, when I come, it's going to be like the lightning that shines in the sky. When lightning lights up the sky, there's no doubt there's lightning going on. There's no doubt that something is happening. He said, that's what it's going to be like when I return. Verse 28, therefore, he says, for wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. The carcass refers to a dead body, of course. Israel as a nation is dead. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 23, behold, your house is left to you desolate. You're dead. As a nation, they are dead. The carcasses are the eagles are the birds that would eat carrion and dead flesh. And it's very interesting that the Roman insignia had eagles on it. Roman insignia, their standards was an eagle. And that's what they had. And they surrounded Jerusalem. And so the imagery here is very vivid of eagles gathering around Jerusalem, the dead carcass of that nation, to devour it. And of course, that's exactly what history tells us happened. Now, verses 29 through 31 sounds like the end of time. But when we look at it from a symbolic, prophetic viewpoint, what Jesus is using here is imagery that's found in the prophets to denote the fall of a nation. It's vivid imagery to describe the fall of a nation. He doesn't start talking about the end of time until verse 36. 29 through 31 is talking about the end of Israel as a nation and Christ using providentially the Roman Empire to bring judgment upon Jerusalem and destroying it. Verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Verse 29, you find this in the prophets. It talks about the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light. Imagery within the prophets to denote the fall of a nation. Verse 30, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the heaven. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and glory. That sounds like the end of time, right? I want you to turn in your Old Testament to Isaiah 19. Isaiah 19. Remember, it says the Son of Man, that's Christ, He's going to be coming on the clouds of heaven with great power and glory. Look at Isaiah 19 in verse 1. This is a proclamation here against the nation of Egypt, how that God is going to punish that nation for its wickedness. Isaiah 19 and verse 1, the burden against Egypt. Behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and will come into Egypt. The idols of Egypt will totter at His presence, and the heart of Egypt will melt in its midst. Now, is that talking about something literally that would happen, or is that talking about God using another nation to bring judgment upon Egypt? Well, of course, the second one is true. That's what happened in history. how that God would use a nation like the Assyrians or the Babylonians to conquer another nation. God was at work behind the scenes, providentially, but it says here that he would ride on a swift cloud and come into Egypt, and those idolatrous temples and stuff would totter. They would fall as he would come in. That describes how a conquering nation would come into that place like Egypt, destroy all their idols, of course set up shrines to their own gods. So this is the imagery here that we find, symbolic imagery to denote God bringing judgment upon a nation. This is the kind of imagery that Jesus is using here. His coming with clouds and heaven in the heavens with great power and glory is not the end of the world in this passage. It's referring to him using the Roman Empire to bring judgment upon Jerusalem because it is the headquarters of Israel. Now look at verse 31. He will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. That gathering together is the getting out of Jerusalem. It is the getting out of Jerusalem, as he spoke of earlier. That him who is in the field not go back for his clothes. Those who are with nursing children are going to have hard time. Pray that your flight may not be in the winter, but nor on the Sabbath. Those who are in Judea, flee to the mountains, verse 16. That is what he's talking about there. The elect, his Christians, are going to be taken out of Jerusalem when they remember what Jesus said. When they remember his teachings, and when they read this, because they would have the book of Matthew by the end of the 60s of the first century. They could remember what Jesus said, some of them, and they could read it right here and say, whoa, we need to get out of Jerusalem. So that's the symbolism here. The angels are going to have a great sound and trumpet. They will gather together his elect from the four winds. Imagery of saving them out of Jerusalem. Verse 32. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branches has already become tender, puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. In other words, signs. Signs. You know summer is coming when you start seeing things bloom. The trees start putting out the buds. Certain plants start growing. You know that's a sign that summer is coming. Verse 33. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors. Again, he's telling his disciples this is what's going to happen. Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. So that includes verses 29 through 31. That's going to take place within that generation. So it cannot be literal, because obviously Jesus had not returned physically at this point of 70 AD. He's not talking about the end of the world in verses 29 through 31. Now, verse 35. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. What I'm telling you is sure. The heavens and the earth, they are going to pass away. But my message will never pass away. God's word is eternal. Now, any questions about what we looked at so far before we get into the next part? He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. He's answering the first question. What are the signs of these things happening? Now, I want you to notice verse 36, the transitional word. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. He's now, from this point on, going to talk about the end of the world, which obviously has not taken place yet, because we're still here. And notice he switched from saying days to day. Did you notice that? Look at verse 19. He says, woe to those who are pregnant and have nursing babes in those days. Look at verse 22. Unless those days were shortened. Verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days. Talking about a period of time leading up to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. But in verse 36, he says that day. That's talking about the end of time. The last day when he returns. But of that day, no one knows. He gave all these signs for the destruction of Jerusalem. He says, but when I return for the heaven and the earth to pass away, nobody knows. No one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. In the other parallel accounts, it says the Son doesn't even know. Talking about himself. No one knows, not even the angels of heaven, not the Son, but the Father only. Now, how can someone today say, we know when the earth is going to end? How can someone put up a billboard and say, this is the date of the end of the earth? We don't know. They're claiming to know something that Jesus and no one can know. Now, notice what he's talking about here as he gives an illustration in verse 37. But as the days of Noah were, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man. Worldwide event, the flood. Destruction of Jerusalem, local. Right there at Jerusalem, the end of a nation. The destruction of the world, global. Talking about Noah's flood. He said people were just going on as life as normal until the flood came. And they did not know until the flood came. No signs, no indication. Did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will be the coming of the Son of Man. There will be no signs. So when people say, oh, I know Jesus, He's coming soon, I can just see all the signs around us, earthquakes and tsunamis and famines and HIV, and it's not in the Bible. There will be no signs. Life will go on as normal. And then suddenly He will return. That's the point. Then He's going to say there's a separation. Verse 40. Then two men will be in the field. One will be taken, the other left. Two women will be at the grinding at the mill. One will be taken, the other left. Watch therefore, for you do not know the hour your Lord is coming. He's saying again, you don't know. We live together here with people, but there will be a separation when Christ returns. This is not talking about what is called a rapture. It's talking about a separation of people. Some people will be separated. Two women will be together, but they'll be separated. Two men will be in the field. There will be separation taking place when Christ returns. Watch, therefore. Verse 42. For you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. Then he gives an illustration here. Verse 43 and 44. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore, look at verse 44. Therefore, you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. How much clearer can it be that it's going to be no indication whatsoever? It's going to come like a thief in the night. 2 Peter chapter 3 talks about the day of the Lord coming as a thief in the night. Unexpectedness of it. A thief, if he's a good, smart thief, and I don't mean good by morally good, if he knows what he's doing upstairs, he's not going to give you any indication he's going to break into your house. He's not going to send you a message. He's not going to text you and tell you he's about to break into your house. He's not going to be waiting right in front of your door as you leave to go. He's going to be hidden, and he will break into your house, and you won't know when it's going to happen. No signs, no indicators. And Jesus is saying that's exactly how it's going to be when I return. Now, he's not giving a sanction to thieves. He's not doing that. He's saying this is just how it's going to be. It's going to be unexpected. Be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. So, as we have looked at this, he was preparing them to be ready to get out of Jerusalem when the temple would be destroyed and when that nation would end as a nation. They had to have signs for that because they had to on foot get out of Jerusalem. They had to get out of Jerusalem, go to Judea, go to the hills. But when Christ returns, you tie that in with the other passages. He's coming back in flaming fire and great glory. He's coming back with his holy angels. He's coming back unexpectedly. It doesn't matter where you are. Your location doesn't matter. None whatsoever. And so the rest of the passages he's going to talk about is going to talk about preparedness. Being ready when he returns. Doing what the Lord wants you to be doing when he returns. So we don't have to be concerned when he returns because we'll always be ready because we're always living for him. If you're always ready to go when he returns, it doesn't matter when it returns, when that happens, or if it even happens in our lifetime. Look at verses 45 through 51. Probably have time to look at this and then the lesson will be over. Who then is a faithful and wise servant? Of course, we all want to be faithful and wise servants, right? Whom his master made ruler over his household to give them food in due season. Blessed is the servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. Assuredly I say to you that he will make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him, and at an hour that he is not aware of. He will cut him in two and appoint his portion with the hypocrites. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. What's that talking about? The weeping and gnashing of teeth. Hell. Eternal punishment. Eternal agony in hell. So he's using the illustration of a master who has servants. He trusts his servants. He's given a task for his servants to do, and he's going to go away. Well, Jesus gave his church a task to do, work to do. He went away. He's in heaven. One day he's going to come back. And he's saying, in essence, I expect to see my people doing what they ought to be doing. And when I find them doing what they ought to be doing, that person is going to be blessed. As he says in chapter 25, well done, thou good and faithful servant. Enter into the joys of the Lord. But if the person isn't doing what they're doing, they start being like the world. Notice what it says there in verse 49. Begins to beat his fellow servants, mistreat his brethren, and to eat and drink with the drunkards. It's going to be like the world. The master of that servant is going to come. Christ is going to return, and that person is not going to be prepared, and he's going to cut him in two. That's imagery of punishment, and assign his portion with the hypocrites. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. In other words, this person claimed to be a servant of mine, but they acted just like the world, and I will assign them to eternal punishment when I return. So, this is, in a nutshell, Matthew chapter 24. The other chapters dealing with that, dealing with the return of Christ, all of Matthew chapter 25 is talking about the return of Jesus Christ at the end of time, the parable of the wise and foolish virgins, the parable of the talents, and then Christ returning and all nations being before him, and he's separating them as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And it ends with verse 46 in Matthew 25. These the lost, will go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into everlasting life. There's hell, there's heaven. It's that simple. There's no in between. There's no purgatory. There's no place that's an in between when it comes to the end of the world and when it comes to Judgment Day. It's either heaven or hell. And when you read those parables there, it emphasizes us being prepared, using the talents that God blesses us with, and having that responsibility before God. Being busy doing God's will so that whenever the Master comes, we will be ready. It's very interesting. We'll close on this thought that in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians that deals with the return of Christ, both of those books do. When it talks about Christ returning, verse 15 of 1 Thessalonians 4, "For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will by no means precede those who are asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first." Verse 17, "Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds and meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore comfort one another with these words." In fact, Titus tells us, or Paul tells Titus, that we're looking for that blessed hope and glorious appearing of our great God and Savior. So for the faithful Christian, whenever he returns is not an issue, because you're always ready. And so that's what we have to prepare for in our life, to always be ready when Christ returns. Like I said, there's so much more to be said as far as details concerning Matthew chapter 24, and in the future I will give a lesson detailing the verses more so. Next week is singing, last Wednesday night of the month, and so the following Wednesday night we're going to start with a new chapter. Be sure and read the rest of this chapter here, chapter 6, and in 2 weeks we will start on page 57, which is chapter 7, as we look at the miracles of Jesus. So the rest of the chapter you study for yourself, and in 2 weeks we'll take up with the miracles of Jesus.